we changed the time of our regular board meeting because we wanted to have this at this time, just as we were going into Yom Ha'Atzmaut.
Oh,
so we
wonderful. We are honored and really excited to be here.
we have a mix of congregants and board members, and and I was really pleased to see how many people donated to the campaign. We had over 30 different people. Now that was a really great turnout.
Yeah, mutual feelings. We're honestly so grateful for the partnership and everyone's support here. And I mean, I was going to share a little bit in a few minutes, but West Suburban Temple Har Zion has been a long time committed partner of IsraAid's, and we have a very special relationship with you all. So we're very grateful, and especially Chai and Carol Solomon, who have been supporters of our work as well.
Thank you so much. So we're really looking forward to the presentation, but we're going to, well, let's just begin. We're going to begin since it's 7:05, and even on Jewish Standard Time, that's already a good time to begin. And Chag Sameach. So we're going to begin with a little bit of singing to celebrate the Chag, right? It's been 73 years since the modern state was created, and we became, as the Psalms exclaim, like dreamers, kechomim, and that we are an am chofshi be'artzenu. We are a free people in our land, the Jewish people back in their land, and thousands of years of dreaming finally coming to being. And yes, we have difficulties and we have challenges, but we still are in awe of the wonders and of the accomplishments. Lately, the vaccination drive, which made headlines around the world, our high tech, as always, and our humanitarian aid, expertise in water resources, and then trauma therapy led by IsraAid, which gives us so much nachas, and just the creativity and resourcefulness of the Jewish people back in their land after so long. And we kind of take it for granted, but having a Jewish state has really changed Jewish people all over the world, not just in Israel, whether it's from the rebirth of Hebrew to just the pride in the accomplishments of Israel, or to now Israeli TV shows and Israeli cooking and food, which has become at the forefront of even our culture here in America. And I think for many of us, our love of Israel goes to the pioneering spirit of the early days when Israel was rerooting itself in the land and finding that spirit of renewal. And I remember once being at a Shabbat table in Jerusalem, and I was with a group of friends, and we were singing, and family members were singing Shabbat songs. And with us was one secular Israeli, and she was a professional singer. And we were singing our Shabbat songs, but then she sang kibbutz songs, and her kibbutz songs were so beautiful. They were just had this simplicity and purity to them that I still remember to this day. So let us begin with that pioneering spirit. We're going to sing a few songs with Cantor Figa, and then we'll go on to our presentation.
Okay, this was a request of Rabbi Glix. He wanted us to sing Al Kol Eileh. Al hadvash ve'al ha'oketz, al hamar ve'hamatok, al biteinu hatinoket, shmor eli atov, al ha'esh ha'mevoeret, al hamayim hazakim, al ha'ish hashav habayta min hamerchakim, al kol eleh, al kol eleh, shmor na li eli ha'atov, al hadvash al ha'aketz al hamar ve'hamatok al natar kor natua al tishkach et
that's right. Shimon.
hashiveni ve'ashuva el haaretz hatova.
Thank you, Cantor.
Let me see. I think I want to go back to share, a different share. I'm also nervous. Ah, here we go. Stop share. How about the beautiful song, The Blue and the White? כחול ולבן, זה צבע שלי, זה צבע שלי. כחול ולבן, צבעי אדמתי, צבעי אדמתי. כחול ולבן, כחול ולבן, כחול ולבן, כחול ולבן, זה צבע שלי כל ימיי לעולם. כחול ולבן, כחול ולבן, צבעי אדמתי, צבעי אדמתי. זה צבע שלי, זה צבע שלי, כל ימיי לעולם, כל ימיי לעולם. כחול ולבן, כחול ולבן, צבעי אדמתי, צבעי אדמתי, זה צבע שלי כל ימיי לעולם.
Are we doing another one, Cantor, or?
Here it comes.
Here it comes.
This is by a friend of yours. This is the Shlomo. Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. 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 Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael 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 Chai. And we mean it.
Yasher Koach. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you. So let us turn now to our presentation, and we're so grateful to have our friends from IsraAid with us, our partners from IsraAid. We go we go way back. We had our campaign to help the refugees in Lesbos, but even before then, my brother came to speak to us. I think the year before that, we've had Sally Oren speak to us. We've had many events and many meetings with IsraAid, and we're grateful to be able to continue our relationship. You saw the good news before our session started. We made our goal, and thank you so much for the wonderful gift of the Solomons, for their matching donation. That really helped galvanize our congregation, and we're so excited. We're going to be able to do this really big mitzvah, and that's a really wonderful thing. Right, we're especially helping refugees. We Jews know about what it's like to be a stranger, so it's within us to help where we can. And we had, as I said, over 30 people from our congregation who donated, and that's a lot. So we're here to celebrate tonight, and we're here to hear more. With us, we have Sarit, who is Senior Director of Operations. We have Rachel, who is IsraAid Director of Outreach and Engagement, and they will introduce Councilman Fernando Vazquez. We have the great honor of welcoming him as an IsraAid ambassador to talk to us. So thank you so much for being here. I turn it over to you.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you so much, Rabbi Glick. Thank you, of course, to the congregation. First, I'll say I'm Rachel Wallace. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement at IsraAid, based in Los Angeles. And it's really been a privilege and a pleasure for IsraAid to be working with your congregation all of these years. And you really are such a special and ideal partner. And I know many of you are familiar with the work of IsraAid all over the world because we've been working together for so long. And your support has really made such a meaningful difference in the lives of, in this case, refugees and all sorts of communities, survivors of natural disasters, asylum seekers, etc. So it's really special for us to be here today for Yom Ha'Atzmaut. I can't think of a more fitting moment and fitting celebration than to acknowledge and celebrate the unique Israeli humanitarian aid contributions that IsraAid makes to the world. And it's in large part really thanks to you all. And we'll talk a little bit more about this today, but everyone here is familiar, of course, that your congregation is supporting a sports field in Colombia for Venezuelan refugee and mixed migrant children. And I'll address a little bit about this, but if you think about it, this is so special and significant for the children with which we work. Because you can imagine, right, these are refugee children that are fleeing such trauma and crises that sometimes they've really forgotten how to be kids. So the fact that they have this kind of sports field where they can move around and play and participate in IsraAid's unique creative and play therapy programs, this is really special and important for them and very important to help them grow from a lot of the trauma that they may have gone through. So Fernando actually will be joining us in a few minutes, and we're very fortunate to have him as one of IsraAid's ambassadors. But I'll start with a little bit of a background about IsraAid. I think you can all see my screen, yes? Great, so I'll start just with a little bit of a background about IsraAid and also some of the updates that are going on now, some of the current projects. I know COVID-19, of course, is on top of mind. So first of all, for those who maybe aren't as familiar or who may not remember, IsraAid is actually Israel's leading humanitarian aid organization. So often we might hear in our circles that Israel is the first country on the ground to respond to a natural disaster, a refugee crisis, a health epidemic like COVID-19, whatever it might be. And most of the time when you hear that, it's actually us. It's actually IsraAid that is the first organization on the ground out of God knows how many humanitarian aid organizations But we're not only the first most of the time, we're also the last to leave. And this is something very special about us, is that we stay in a country, in the field, often long after the cameras leave, after the news leaves, after the media leaves, because we really want to make sure that communities can rebuild after humanitarian crises. And as obvious as it sounds, right, it doesn't take a week or a month, it could sometimes take years. So we are a very long-term focused organization when we respond not only to emergency needs, but also the long-term needs of communities all over the world. And we've been around since 2001, so almost 20 years we have been responding to natural disasters, to refugee crises, post-conflict situations, and health epidemics, and we've been in 55 countries since our founding. So our mission to support people affected by humanitarian crisis and partner with local communities around the world. So this is really key in terms of our partnership. IsraAid doesn't initiate anything in the field unless we have a local partner, and that might be a school, might be a place of worship. For example, we work with a lot of synagogues when we deploy to different countries. Might be a government agency. Whatever it might be, we take what we call a communities first approach. And that's really just what it sounds like. It's about putting the communities first and listening to the communities that we work with, because sometimes they know the terrain, they know their people, they know the local culture better than we do coming in. So everything that we do in the field is a partnership. And that's why we're very effective. And in terms of staff diversity, we not only have a diverse Israeli staff, which I'll talk about, but about 80% of our staff all over the world come from the local communities with which we work. So that's very intentional. And in Colombia now, for example, we've been able to hire Venezuelan refugees onto our staff team. So that's very important. In countries, for example, like Greece and Germany, where you have supported our work very generously in the past, we also work with Israeli Jews, Israeli Arab Muslims we've brought onto our team, Israeli Arab Christians, Druze, in addition to the local Middle Eastern refugee population that we've also hired on. So this is really what makes us successful, is in large part the Israeli staff diversity that we are able to bring. And our staff really mirrors the diversity of the state of Israel. And of course, another reason why we are successful is because we bring incredible expertise from Israel. I might be preaching to the choir a little bit, but most of us probably know that Israel is advanced when it comes to water technology, when it comes to mental health and trauma and psychosocial support expertise. And in many cases, it's because Israel has to be. They have to be experts in these fields. You know, when it comes to mental health, unfortunately, it's a country that faces a lot of crises, and it has to deal with it within its own borders. But it's such an Israeli attitude to think, you know, okay, we've been through a lot. We've endured, unfortunately, a lot of trauma as a result of various terror attacks, but we've grown from that. We're resilient. And now we're in a position where we can use the expertise that we developed to give back to the world. And so at IsraAid, that's exactly what we do every day. And I can't emphasize enough, we are successful in large part because of who and where our partnerships are. So we are truly, truly grateful for West Suburban Temple Har Zion's partnership. A little bit about our areas of expertise. I mentioned a little bit, for example, water, or WASH as we say, water, sanitation, and hygiene expertise that we bring from Israel, not only in terms of water technology and building water filtration systems, but also in terms of a lot of WASH education. You know, in other words, how to wash your hands and keep clean, which we now know during COVID is so, so important. Also protection, psychological support, working with communities to support their emotional needs, respond to a lot of the trauma they might be going through after a big disaster or refugee crisis. And that's very important. This, in many cases, protection is what makes IsraAid unique in the humanitarian aid field. And this is an expertise that we bring to the field that many humanitarian aid organizations do not. So that's one way that we are unique and we stand out. Another, of course, is that we also work in areas that, frankly, other humanitarian aid agencies don't work in. And so we really make sure that a lot of the most vulnerable and in some cases the most remote communities of a country really get the humanitarian aid and support that they deserve. And of course, health and medical care. Probably many of you know that this is also a field of our work because you all supported our medical response in Lesbos, Greece, when we were treating thousands of refugees that were coming onto the shores of Lesbos. So a little bit of a map about where IsraAid has been. As you can see, in 2021, we are across the map from the Bahamas to Germany, Colombia, even in the United States. So we're pretty spread out. And a couple examples of our projects. This is in Kakuma refugee camp, one of the largest refugee camps in the world in Kenya. On the left, that was actually in the middle, Lior was our water engineer from Israel and Kenya. On the right, actually, this was part of our psychosocial support and a lot of our mental health programming. And you can see from these photos that we train local community leaders so that they can then bring the skills and the tools that come from IsraAid to the local communities with which they work. So we're very effective in that way. That's how we're able to reach a lot of people. Greece, as you know, we are still running educational programming for refugees, a lot of creative art therapy, a lot of some movement therapy. That's also a lot of what we do all over the world. And I'll underscore that a lot of the creative therapy programs that we use are also used in Sderot. And for those who may not be familiar, Sderot is an Israeli city right on the border of Gaza. So they chronically face a lot of rocket attacks. And so especially for children, there are a lot of very creative Israeli therapy techniques used.
So I just want to, can I interrupt you for a second? If you go back,
by all means.
The photo credit is, forgot to mention this link.
Oh yes, I'm so glad you mentioned this.
Juliana, who was the Cantor's a stepdaughter, who was an intern in Lesbos for the summer. So how cool that that her picture.
Yeah. Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Juliana is such a wonderful IsraAid fellow and ambassador. And yeah, she was with us in Greece and made a wonderful impact there as well. And then back in her home community and on her home campus, where we find especially important to share a lot of these messages around IsraAid and the work that we do and showcase the spirit of Israel in a positive light. And I will, before going into the Venezuelan refugee crisis, I wanted to highlight this project in Eswatini. This is, first of all, is anyone familiar with the country of Eswatini? Maybe, have you heard the name or does it sound familiar? Okay. I see a lot of people shaking their heads no. So if I ask, have you heard of Swaziland? Does that ring a bell? Maybe a little more? Okay, so Swaziland recently changed its name a few years ago to Eswatini. So it's a very small country, not one that we regularly hear about in the US news, as far as I know. But we were actually invited by the government of Eswatini to help with the nation's COVID-19 rollout and response. Because probably also a lot of us here know that Israel was very successful in its COVID-19 vaccine distribution. So as a result, we were invited by the government with a similar size nation to help also with the awareness campaigns and with the vaccine rollout. So this is one of our newest deployments. Okay, so this is also, as you know, Venezuelan refugee and mixed migrant crisis. This is obviously a topic of importance and significance to your congregation, given the fundraiser that you guys are supporting. And this is also a very important refugee and mixed migrant crisis for IsraAid. And we've been in Colombia since around 2019 now, responding to this refugee and mixed migrant crisis, which is on its way to becoming one of the biggest in the world. So today, at least on paper, there are about 5.4 million Venezuelans who have fled Venezuela. And to put it into context, they're at mid-2020 anyway, the numbers for the Syrian refugee crisis were about 6.6 million. So a lot of experts are saying that this crisis will soon surpass the Syrian numbers. And so it's pretty daunting. And about 2 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants are now settling in Colombia, which is a neighboring country, and they're fleeing violence and shortages of basically essential food and medicine and basic services. And while technically there's no war, it's as if these people are living in a war zone. And so they're fleeing to neighboring countries in search of better lives. And a very recent piece of news actually is that the Colombian government declared that the Venezuelan refugees and migrants that are now in their country are legal. So that means they can find jobs, children can enroll in school, etc. And the reason actually why I say both refugees and migrants is because, believe it or not, a lot of these people from Venezuela that are now making their way back to Colombia, here you could see a little bit on the map, just to orient us. So they're going from Venezuela back to Colombia, and many of them actually are ethnic Colombian, and they years ago actually had made their way to Venezuela, and now many of them are going back. So this red dot over here, hard to tell, but this is an area called Barranquilla, which is where a lot of IsraAid's projects are, including the child-friendly space that I'll talk about, and including the sports field. So I'll start with a video before we go into specific projects.
Colombia, specifically the areas around Barranquilla, Colombia. Now, what Israel's doing here is a little bit different than what they were doing in Guatemala. So to understand exactly what's going on, we're actually going to talk with the co-CEO of all of IsraAid, Yotam Polizer. Come on.
In Colombia, our main focus is to support the refugees from Venezuela. We're talking about over 1 million refugees who came in the last couple of years because of the crisis in Venezuela. They're living in terrible, terrible conditions. They have no support. They have no access to education, access to basic services. A lot of them are unemployed. So it's both a humanitarian crisis that creates an economic crisis and a social crisis on so many levels.
So why are they leaving Venezuela?
They live in Venezuela because A, they're not safe there due to the political situation, and B, the unstable political situation created almost a hunger there. Some people are on the verge of starvation, and they really have no choice but to leave their home and look for a better future for them and for their families. They hope to be back if things get better, but at the moment, it's really, really devastating.
We then had the opportunity to go to a school and meet some of the refugees from Venezuela.
Es muy difícil que un niño de uno le diga, mamá, tengo hambre, y uno no tenga para darle. Es muy duro uno ver a sus hijos cuando están acostumbrados a vestir bien y de repente no tener para uno vestirlo, darle, es muy difícil, y por eso a veces emigramos y no es fácil. No es fácil porque nos juzgan, a veces nos tratan mal. Gracias a Dios contamos con personas como ustedes y como muchas que también nos brindan la mano, nos apoyan y nos dan como que ese aliento para uno seguir adelante.
La situación en Venezuela ha llegado además a tan lejos que han venido personas de otros países como de Israel a venir a ayudar a los venezolanos porque han visto la situación en la que estamos. Se le agradece mucho por la ayuda que nos han prestado y por el empeño que tienen ustedes hacia con nosotros, con nuestros hijos. Me la muy agradecida.
How are Israelis specifically equipped to help in this situation?
So IsraAid has been since 2001 working in 52 countries, including many refugee crises. For example, the Syrian refugee crisis, the Yazidi refugees, refugees from South Sudan in East Africa. So we have a lot of experience in working with this type of population who went through terrible trauma. And we know that there's no magic solution, right? It's really a long-term process. And what we're trying to do here is to empower the community and to give them skills and tools so eventually they'll be able to support themselves. So our main focus here is develop local leadership within the refugee community. Working in the refugee context is so Jewish.
Yeah.
This is our own history. The story of the refugees is the story of the Jewish people. So we really feel this special connection, and we're here in the long run to help.
We ended our journey and talked with IsraAid's head of mission in Colombia, Juliana. She's done an incredible job of building community with the refugees of Venezuela.
It's incredible to think that 6 months ago we're having this conversation. They're looking at me, who's this Israeli that speaks with like a funny Colombian accent? And 6 months later, we built a child-friendly space. We have impacted the lives of more than 150 people. And I can call them my friends, you know, and it just, you know, like every person that touches your heart, you know, like once you become vulnerable and the other person becomes vulnerable in turn, it just changes you. Like you cannot stop it. It's just the way it goes.
Great. Sorry. Can you hear me? Weird echo. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay. So that's every time I see that video, I know it's moving for me. And so you heard a little bit about the Venezuelan refugee crisis from Yotam and some of our projects. Before I turn it over to Fernando, who's here with us, who's one of our stellar IsraAid ambassadors, I'll just briefly mention these are some photos of one of our child-friendly spaces, or as we say, CFS, which are literally spaces where kids can just be kids. You can imagine as refugees, they've gone through a lot. And so in the spaces, they benefit from a lot of our creative mental health and trauma support programs, and also a lot of our educational programs, which now actually we're discovering are especially important because many of these refugee children have been out of school for several years. And now the education that we provide hopefully will catch them up so that they can enroll in school in Colombia, which now they're allowed to do. So that declaration from the Colombian government that these people are legal there, that's a game changer for our work. And I can say a little bit more, but I'd actually love to turn it over to our amazing ambassador, Fernando. So if you could maybe introduce yourself and say hello and share a little bit how you got involved in IsraAid.
Thank you, Rachel, so much for asking me to participate in this. It's always a pleasure to join our IsraAid family. Good evening, everybody, and great to see everybody out from Chicago out there. I know it's I heard from Los Angeles. We always like to meet all the supporters of IsraAid over the years. My name is Fernando Vazquez. I am been in IsraAid now involved going about 3 years now. I used to be the mayor for the city of Downey. I did public office here for about 8 years here in public office in the Los Angeles area. Born and raised here in the community and here locally, and So I first came in part with IsraAid a couple years back when we went to Puerto Rico for the humanitarian relief efforts as a result of the hurricane. That was my first experience with IsraAid, and just there was about 35 Latino leaders from the U.S. that went out there, and you really got to see IsraAid's work. With that, the opportunity came up about a year later to go to Colombia, and I couldn't say no. Once you see the work that IsraAid does, it's really hard to say no to this organization. So of all the different boards that I'm on, the nonprofits, IsraAid is one of them near and dear to my heart. I've also had a chance to go to Israel a couple years back, and for us that Latino leaders, when we really see the work that IsraAid is doing, it really exemplifies of the true values of what our Israeli partners, brothers and sisters, really believe in. Is providing that hope and that the really willingness to help those that are most vulnerable and in need. And when we think of all the nonprofits out there, I can't think of any other organization that's really doing this humanitarian relief efforts at a time when families are very vulnerable and need help. All they're looking is for a lifeline out there. So we went to Colombia a couple years ago back. I think it seemed that was probably the last trip I took right before the pandemic unfolded. So we went out, I think it was in February or March of last year. We went out to Colombia with a delegation of Latino leaders out there. And we just really saw the impact, right? That when you start talking to the children in the community, you go visit the schools, you see the impact that IsraAid's having and really just giving them a hope. You see the mental health needs that are there, the sustainability efforts. In our particular case, we went to a near Barranquilla. We went out to the school there of refugee students that came from Venezuela, and you really get a chance to speak to them, really hear from them of what it is that how they got there, and then talk to some of the families. It was a changing experience for me because what's happening in Colombia right now with the Venezuelan crisis, Rachel alluded to earlier, you don't really hear about that much in the media. And when you're there and you see just the magnitude of the challenges going on to the Venezuelan community and how IsraAid is there really helping at ground zero, it really says about what IsraAid does, but also the Israeli culture. A deep level of respect for the work that happens here. So I, having been there, spent about almost a week down there, paid for it out of my own pockets. It wasn't like IsraAid was paying for my trip or anything of that. You really get to see firsthand the work they're doing. So when you hear about organizations and natural disasters, the first organization that comes to my mind is always IsraAid. They're not the biggest, but in my opinion, they're the mightiest. And they really go out there, whether it's water sustainability efforts, whether it's behavioral health, whether it's humanitarian relief efforts, just mobilizing and outskirts of communities where you don't typically think of. IsraAid just did an amazing job with that. So I look forward to coming out of this pandemic. So looking to our next humanitarian relief effort, that opportunity that we get, but always what's happening out there, not just unique to what's happening in Colombia, but all the work they're doing throughout the entire world. IsraAid, it doesn't get more impactful in my mind than what the work IsraAid does as a result of their water sustainability, behavioral health, and also medical support relief efforts to the community. So with that, Rachel, just wanted to stop by and share some words. It's great to see you, Rachel, again, and the entire IsraAid team. I look forward to catching up with you guys sometime soon.
Mutual feelings. Thank you. Those were all really.
You.
The sun is like a weird position, but that was really, really valuable to hear. And I know you mentioned also about water, and you mentioned response to natural disasters, which is also a key part of what we do. I'm not sure how many have heard, but actually several months ago, there was a hurricane that struck Colombia, Hurricane Iota. So a lot of these communities with which IsraAid is working now are experiencing almost a triple crisis because they came as refugees from Venezuela to Colombia. Then they had to deal with COVID-19. And then recently, a hurricane. So as we say in our organization, disasters don't wait. Unfortunately, the hurricane doesn't care that there's a pandemic going on. So fortunately, we did already have a team in Colombia, and we were able to respond very quickly, very efficiently that way. We were either the first or one of the first international humanitarian aid organizations to respond to Hurricane Iota. And I know it's 5:44. I've done a lot of talking, and I can always talk some more. I'll just end by saying a little bit more about the sports field. That, again, this is such an important project, especially now because of COVID-19. First of all, it's immensely helpful to have an outdoor space where IsraAid can run a lot of its programming, a lot of its mental health, psychosocial support programming. And of course, as I mentioned before, sports and play and being outdoors, that's especially so valuable and so important for children who have undergone very difficult crises throughout their lives. So we're very, very grateful again to your congregation, of course, to the Solomons and Rabbi Glick for your leadership and for inviting us here today. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Fernando, for being here. Anybody have any questions this evening before we wrap up? I have a question about the sports field. Do we have an ETA on construction and all that, all those details?
Good question. Sarit, do you have any further details about that?
I believe they got started on the project already, and will provide you with an update shortly, even interim, a few pictures how the project is moving along, and then hopefully B'ezrat Hashem very soon we'll have the final pictures with you all to share.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, unless anybody has a pressing question, we might just wrap up. We have a board meeting to get to in just a few minutes. But I wanted to thank you all. And right in Israel, you go into Yom Ha'Atzmaut from Yom HaZikaron, which is a day when we think about the brokenness of the world, we think about the suffering, we think about the soldiers who were lost in the wars and those who died in terror attacks. And so we go from brokenness, and then we go to the celebration of life, the celebration of the state of Israel, which is two tropes, which I talk a lot about, as you all know from the Bima, and is deeply in our Jewish selves, taking the brokenness of the world, but not being discouraged by it, but seeing that as an impetus to go and fix it and to do something about it. And we live in this changing world due to so many factors, climate change and failed states and economic crisis. And because of that, there's already a lot of trouble, a lot of results from that, migration and refugee crises, and there'll probably be more. And so we're grateful there's an Israeli organization out there that's being a light unto the nations and that's doing this work. And we're also proud of partnering with you. And it was such a wonderful moment to see when we met our goal. And of course, there's always more work to be done. So if there's anybody here who didn't have a chance to contribute, there's always a place for you to help more. And everything is tremendously appreciated. So since it is Yom Ha'Atzmaut, let us end with the Israeli anthem, Hatikva. Cantor Figa. You're on mute, Cantor. Still on mute. I'm going to rise as
I got it. I got it.
Okay, okay, okay.
Here
Please
we
rise.
go. Kol levav b'nima, nefesh Yehudi omiyah, ulfatem Yizrach kadima, Ayin Zion Sophia, Od lo avda tikvateinu, Hatikva shnot alpayim, Liot amchoshi be'artzeinu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim, Liod Amchoshi be'artzeinu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim.
Toda, Cantor, Chag Sameach, everyone. Thank you to everyone for all of their efforts. Thank you to IsraAid.